international correspondent Keir Simmons, thank you so much. And now for deeper insight, joining me now is retired four-star U.S. Navy Admiral James Stavridis, Msnbc chief international security analyst, former Supreme Allied Commander at NATO, and the author of To Risk It All, 9 Conflicts and the Crucible of Decision. Admiral, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show, but we need to have a very serious conversation about what we're seeing happening over in the Middle East. How close are we to seeing an all-out regional war break out?
We're closer than we were just a week ago, Katie. And what I mean by that is if you'd asked me a week ago, I would have said maybe a 10% chance of a wide regional war, which I'll define as Iran entering the fight alongside Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, and then probably the United States getting involved. I think the chances of that were about 10%, still kind of high. Unfortunately, Katie, after the events that you and Keir just described a moment ago, I'd say that chance is now elevated to somewhere around 20%. That's significant, even in a volatile region like the Middle East.
Admiral, in the immediate weeks, if not days after October 7th, you and I talked about this ending up being a multi-front war for Israel, one that's not ideal for that country. But I kind of want to shift a little bit of the focus, though, to talk about even the United States, right? Ibrahim Akil, the commander of Hezbollah's Radwan force, the man who was just killed just yesterday. You know, he was sanctioned by the U.S. for being involved in 2 terrorist attacks in 1983 that killed more than 300 people in the U.S. Embassy in Beirut and the U.S. Marine Corps barracks. That's Americans, Admiral, that were killed. This was 1983, and we're still talking about him, Hezbollah, 20-something years later. What's going on here, Admiral, that the control over these type of terrorist and militant forces seems to be kind of not within anybody's grasp?
So 40 years ago, in 1983, one of my Naval Academy classmates, Marine Corps Captain Vince Smith, was killed in that bombing. He was the first member of the class of 1976 to die in action. He certainly wasn't the last, but we remember him, the military remembers him, and National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan is quite right to say that Akil has significant American blood on his hands. And so taking him off the battlefield is a good thing. On the other hand, the collateral damage here appears to be significant. Civilians, that is always terrible. Part of the blame is for the way that Hezbollah and Hamas certainly does as well, uses civilians as shields, effectively putting their command centers in populated civilian apartment buildings, under schools, and in mosques. But it's incumbent upon the Israelis to do all they can to minimize that collateral damage. And it is always tragic when civilians die, even in my view, the worthy objective of ending the reign of terror brought about by Akil for 40 years, his engagement.
Israel's calling this a new phase of the war, Admiral, when we saw this past week exploding pagers, exploding walkie-talkies and other electronic devices. But to your point, the damage is extensive and includes civilians. Do you think that this now actually spurs the United States to get even more involved? I know President Biden speaks about still achieving a ceasefire, but does that seem to be an actual reality before he leaves office?
I don't think it is, and I give full credit to the president and his team, Jake Sullivan, Secretary of State Tony Blinken, frequent flyer in and out, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, former Ambassador Bill Burns, head of the CIA. All of them have done extraordinary work here. It appears we're not going to get that ceasefire, at least on Team Biden's watch. However, what the United States can effectively do at this point is to ensure we continue to press Israel to care for that civilian population in Gaza. We press the Israelis to do the minimum amount of war fighting that they need to as they pursue their quite legitimate war aims, taking Hamas off the battlefield and ensuring Hezbollah doesn't launch further rockets. We can do all of that while still supporting Israel. But Katie, we ought to be very concerned about how close this region is tipping toward a wider war.
Admiral James Stavridis, there's a reason why I called it a powder keg. You and I both know historically there's been regions that are like that, and what happens thereafter is disastrous. Thank you so much, sir, for spending your time with us and sharing your insight. I appreciate you.